There's an old saying among Special Forces veterans: the deadliest predators are those protecting their family. In a small Georgia diner on a rainy October morning, the Crimson Riders Motorcycle Club learned this lesson the hard way. When they decided to harass a pregnant waitress, not knowing her brother was one of America's most lethal Green Berets. With over 140 confirmed hostile encounters in places the government still won't acknowledge before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bell above Miller's diner chimed through the pre-dawn quiet as Sarah Miller began her morning routine, her 7-month pregnant form moving with practiced deficiency. Despite her growing belly at 26, she carried more than just her unborn daughter. She carried the legacy of 3 generations of Millers who had served the small town of Cedar Grove, Georgia. Through this very diner, the storm that had battered the Georgia countryside all night was finally breaking, leaving behind puddles that reflected the diner's neon sign in fractured ribbons of red and blue. Sarah hadn't wanted to open so early, especially with the weather, but the truckers who regularly stopped at Miller relied on their morning coffee and hot breakfast. Besides, she needed every hour she could get before the baby came. What Sarah didn't know as she brewed the first pot of coffee was that her more was about to collide with something far more dangerous than any storm. The Crimson Riders Motorcycle Club had been expanding their territory across 3 states, and Cedar Grove's strategic location along Interstate 85 had caught their attention. Local businesses were being pressured to pay protection money, and Miller's Diner was next on their list. Sheriff David Cooper watched from his patrol car across the street as 3 motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot, their chrome gleaming wetly in the gray morning light. He'd been tracking the riders' movement into his county, watching helplessly as other businesses folded under their pressure. His hand tightened on his coffee cup, but direct intervention would only make things worse. The riders had connections in the state capitol, and 2 deputies in the neighboring county had already lost their jobs trying to stop them. What the Crimson Riders didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Grove knew except Sarah, was that her brother James was due home today after 6 years of classified operations with the Army's most elite Special Forces unit. He was finally retiring, but the skills that had kept him alive through hundreds of missions, the training that had made him one of America's deadliest soldiers, those didn't retire with the uniform. The first rider through the door was Marcus Switchblade Carter, the club's regional enforcer. His leather cut bore patches that hinted at violent achievements, and his nickname wasn't for show. Behind him came 2 newer members eager to prove themselves. The diner fell silent as they entered the handful of early morning regulars, suddenly very interested in their coffee cups. Beautiful morning, ain't it? Switchblade's voice carried the false friendliness of a predator toying with prey. Zara continued wiping down the counter, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. Shame if anything happened to such a nice establishment. Quick pause here. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is going to leave you speechless. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Grove for years to come as Sarah stood her ground, facing down 3 men who had terrorized businesses across 3 states. None of them noticed the mud-spattered truck that pulled into the parking lot. None of them saw the man who emerged, moving with the controlled grace of someone who had spent years hunting the world's most dangerous prey. James Miller had learned in the Hindu Kush Mountains that the most dangerous moment wasn't when violence erupted, it was in the seconds just before, when the right action could prevent bloodshed entirely. As he entered Miller's Diner, his raincoat concealing the muscle earned through years of combat training, his eyes took in every detail with practiced precision. 3 targets, 2 exits, 8 civilians, his pregnant sister backing away from men whose body language screamed impending violence. The bell above the door chimed one more time, but this time it sounded different. Later, old Joe Barnes would swear it sounded like a warning, like the rattle of a snake, letting you know you'd stepped too close to something deadly. Sheriff Cooper, still watching from across the street, noticed something about the newcomer's movements that made him sit up straighter. 20 years in law enforcement had taught him to read people, and this man moved like someone who had spent time in very dangerous places, the kind Of places that changed how a person walked, how they watched, how they positioned themselves in a room. This stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape Cedar Grove forever. In one moment, there was Sarah Miller, 7 months pregnant, facing down men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. In the next, there was her brother James, bringing with him skills honed in places the government denied existing, about to teach the Crimson Riders why some lines should never be crossed. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the quiet hum of the diner's neon sign. In that silence, Switchblade Carter was about to learn what every enemy who had underestimated James Miller had learned too late: that sometimes the deadliest predators aren't the ones who make the most noise. Sometimes they're the quiet ones who wait for exactly the right moment to show their teeth. The next few minutes would change everything in Cedar Grove, starting a chain of events that would expose not just the Crimson Riders' operations, but a criminal network that stretched from Georgia to Washington, D.C. But in that moment, as James Miller stood in the doorway of his family's diner, watching men threaten his pregnant sister, none of that mattered. All that mattered was teaching them why threatening family was the last mistake they'd ever make. James Miller moved through the diner with the measured grace of a man who had spent years operating in hostile territory. His rain-soaked coat hung heavy on broad shoulders, and though his posture appeared relaxed, Sheriff Cooper noticed how he positioned himself with clear lines of sight to both exits. 20 years in law enforcement had taught Cooper to recognize military training, but this was something different, something that spoke of operations far more dangerous than standard combat. Coffee black, James told his sister quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that experienced combat veterans recognize. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a cup, but her brother's presence seemed to steady her. She'd seen that look in his eyes before, right before his last deployment, the one he still couldn't talk about. Switchblade Carter turned slightly, sizing up the newcomer with the practiced arrogance of a man used to intimidating others. We're having a private business discussion here. A friend might want to take that coffee to go. Behind him, his 2 associates shifted their positions, unconsciously moving to flank James. No private business with my pregnant sister, James replied, his voice remaining conversational, but something in his tone made old Joe Barnes set his coffee cup down very carefully. The retired Marine recognized the cadence of someone used to giving orders in very dangerous situations. At the counter, Sarah watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and growing confidence. She'd never seen her brother in action. His work had always been classified, his missions discussed only in the vaguest terms. But now she understood why he'd been chosen for operations that officially didn't exist. Through the diner's window, Sheriff Cooper observed the subtle shifts in body language that preceded violence. He reached for his radio, then stopped. Something told him intervention might make things worse. The way the newcomer held himself, the precision of his movements. This wasn't someone who needed police assistance. Your sister, Switchblade smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, that makes this a family matter. Then we're just explaining to her how businesses in Cedar Grove can avoid unfortunate accidents. Protection costs money these days. James took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Switchblade's face. 3 states, he said quietly, 14 businesses, 8 cases of arson when protection wasn't paid, 2 hospitalized owners, 1 missing person still unaccounted for. You've been busy. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop. Switchblade's smile vanished, replaced by something harder. You've been doing your homework, friend, but knowing things can be dangerous for a man's health, so threatening pregnant women. James replied. Something shifted in his stance, a subtle change that made Sheriff Cooper sit up straighter in his patrol car. The lawman had seen combat veterans before, but this was different. This was the kind of readiness that came from years of operating in places where one wrong move meant death. In the kitchen, Cook Martinez watched through the service window, his hand gripping the baseball bat he kept for emergencies. But something in James Miller's demeanor made him pause. The way the man controlled space, how he maintained perfect awareness of everyone's positions. This wasn't someone who needed help handling trouble, a last chance to walk away. Switchblade warned His hand drifting toward his jacket, his two associates spread wider, creating firing angles they thought weren't obvious, but James saw it all: the amateur tactics, the telegraphed movements, the overconfidence of men who had never faced a real professional. Interesting choice of backup, James commented, taking another sip of coffee. Rodriguez on your left. Served 4 years, Marine Corps, honorable discharge 2019, never saw combat. Your other friend. Thompson washed out of Army Basic in 20,220, neither has experience with close quarter combat in confined spaces. The bikers froze. Nobody was supposed to know their real names, their background. Switchblade's face darkened. Who the hell are you? Just a brother having coffee with his sister, James replied. But the way he said it, the absolute certainty in his voice, made everyone in the diner realize they were watching something more. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a predator allowing its prey to understand slowly and completely that they had made a terrible mistake. Sarah, still behind the counter, saw something she'd never witnessed before: genuine fear creeping into the eyes of men who had terrorized their community for months. Her brother hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a single threatening gesture, but somehow his mere presence had changed everything. You'll regret this, Switchblade snarled, but his voice lacked its former confidence. Nobody threatens the Crimson Riders. We've got connections you can't imagine. Actually, James set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. I can imagine quite well your operations. In 3 states, your political protection. In Atlanta, your connections to larger criminal networks. I spent the last month mapping all of it. While you were threatening pregnant women, I was preparing to dismantle everything you've built. The professional calm in his voice, the methodical way he laid out their vulnerability, hit harder than any physical threat could have. These weren't the words of someone making idle threats. This was the voice of a man who had spent years taking apart organizations far more dangerous than a motorcycle club. Sheriff Cooper, still watching from his patrol car, saw the exact moment the bikers realized they weren't the predators anymore. They were prey, and they had just walked into the territory of something far deadlier than themselves. The tension in Miller's diner had reached a breaking point in the silence, broken only by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Switchblade Carter and his men were about to learn why some men earn their reputation, not through boasts or threats, but through the kind of quiet competence that comes from years of operating in the shadows. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The confrontation at Miller's diner took an unexpected turn as James slowly stood from his counter seat. His movements were deliberate, each motion calculated with the precision of someone who had spent years operating in environments where the smallest mistake meant death. Switchblade and his men found themselves unconsciously backing away. They're practiced in intimidation tactics, faltering in the face of true professional competence. Let me be clear, James said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding elite units in combat zones. You're going to leave this diner, you're going to get on your bikes, and you're going to spend the next few hours contemplating how badly you've miscalculated. Sarah, watching from behind the counter, saw something she'd never witnessed in all the months the Crimson Riders had terrorized Cedar Grove. Uncertainty in Switchblade Carter's eyes. Her brother hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a single threatening gesture, but somehow he'd completely shifted the power dynamic in the room. You have no idea what you're starting, Switchblade warned, but his voice lacked its former menace. We've got 50 members in 3 states, connections in places you can't touch. James himself, a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. 53 members, actually 32 active. The rest associates. Your main operations run through abandoned warehouses in Atlanta, Chattanooga, and Birmingham. Your political protection comes from Judge Harrison in Atlanta, who's been taking payments through a shell company registered in Delaware. The precision of his intelligence struck like physical blows. These weren't random facts. This was the kind of detailed operational knowledge that came from systematic surveillance and professional intelligence gathering. Sheriff Cooper, still observing from across the street, saw Switchblade's hand drift toward his jacket again, but before the biker could complete the movement, James had closed the distance between them. What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence of events. One moment, Switchblade was reached for what everyone assumed was a concealed weapon. The next, he was frozen in place, James's hand positioned in a way that promised immediate and decisive consequences if the biker continued his motion. That's a Glock 19 in a shoulder holster, James said, conversationally. Modify trigger. Probably illegal. You've got a knife in your left boot, and your friend Thompson is carrying brass knuckles in his right pocket, the kind of weapons that get people federal time when they're caught using them across state lines. The other customers in the diner sat absolutely still, recognizing they were watching something extraordinary. This wasn't just physical dominance, it was the kind of complete tactical awareness that came from years of high-stakes operations. How Switchblade began, but James cut him off. The same way I know about the weapons cache in your clubhouse basement, the same way I know about the drug running operation you're setting up through the trucking company you just acquired, the same way I know about the 3 federal investigations you don't know about yet. Sarah had never heard her brother speak this way. The quiet confidence, the absolute certainty. This was the voice of someone who had spent years dismantling organizations far more dangerous than a motorcycle club. Now, James continued, releasing Switchblade with a subtle push that sent the biker stumbling back. You have a choice to make. You can leave now, rethink your operations in Cedar Grove, and maybe survive what's coming, or you can escalate this situation, and I'll dismantle everything you've built piece by piece through the diner's windows. Sheriff Cooper watched the 3 bikers retreat to their motorcycles. Their movements had lost the swaggering confidence they'd arrived with, replaced by the uncertainty of men who'd suddenly realized they were far out of their depth. As the motorcycles roared away, old Joe Barnes broke the tension with a low whistle. 20 years in the Marines, he said, and I'd never seen anything like that. Your brother, Sarah, he's not just military, is he? Sarah shook her head, one hand protectively cradling her belly. He never could talk about his work, always said it was classified. James returned to his coffee, his movements once again relaxed, but still carrying that underlying readiness that spoke of years. In combat zones, they'll be back, he said quietly to his sister. Men like that, they can't accept being exposed as something less than what they pretend to be. They'll call in reinforcements, try to reassert their dominance. Sheriff Cooper finally entered the diner, drawn by both professional duty and personal curiosity. Want to tell me what that was all about, he asked, though his tone suggested he already had some idea. Just a family matter, Sheriff James replied, but something in the way he said it made Cooper realize he was dealing with someone who operated at levels far beyond local law enforcement. Those men have been causing trouble across 3 states, Cooper said carefully. Nobody's been able to touch them. They've got protection in places that make my job complicated. Had protection, James corrected softly. Things are about to get very complicated for the Crimson Riders and everyone connected to them. Sarah watched her brother with new understanding. The quiet boy who'd left Cedar Grove years ago had returned to something else entirely. Someone who had learned to fight battles that went far beyond physical confrontation. As the morning sun finally broke through George's Clouds, Miller's diner settled back into its routine, but everyone present understood they'd witnessed something significant. The moment when predators realized they had wandered into the territory of something far more dangerous than themselves. And in the growing light, James Miller allowed himself a small smile. The Crimson Riders would be back, yes, but when they returned, they would learn why some men earn their reputation not through violence or intimidation, but through the kind of quiet competence that comes from years of dismantling organizations that thought themselves untouchable. At the Crimson Riders Clubhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Grove, Switchblade Carter faced his regional president, Marcus Iron Mike Davidson, trying to explain how a routine intimidation had turned into a strategic catastrophe. The clubhouse, his main room, usually filled with the confident swagger of men used to controlling their territory, now hummed with nervous tension. He knew everything. Switchblade explained, his usual bravado absent. Our operations, our connections, things that nobody outside the inner circle should know. This wasn't just some protective brother. This was something else entirely. Ion Mike studied the surveillance photos spread across his desk, images of James Miller that had been hastily gathered in the hours since the diner incident. The man's military record was largely classified with more redacted sections than readable text. Made some calls, Iron Mike said. Slowly got a contact in DC who owes us. Says this guy's file has more black ink than the Pentagon's budget. Whatever he did for the government, someone once it kept quiet back at Miller's diner. James was helping Sarah close for the day, his movements methodical as he secured windows, checked sidelines. To anyone watching, it would have appeared as normal end-off-day routine, but Sarah noticed how her brother's eyes constantly scanned for potential threats, how he positioned himself to maintain clear views of all approaches they'll try to gather intelligence first. James explained quietly, drawing on years of experience. Watch patterns, identify vulnerabilities, standard preparation for what they'll see as a restoration of their authority, but what they're actually doing is giving us time to prepare. Sheriff Cooper pulled up just as they were finishing his patrol car's headlights cutting through the growing evening darkness. Thought you should know, he said through his open window. Lot of state bikes coming in, plates from Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina. Whatever you stirred up this morning, it's drawing attention. James nodded, having expected this. They're calling in reinforcements, trying to demonstrate strength. Standard response. When authority is challenged, you might want to get your family out of town for a few days. Sheriff Cooper's face hardened. This is my town, Mr. Miller. If there's trouble coming, there's trouble coming. James confirmed, but not the kind you're trained to handle. These men, they're not just criminals, they're part of something bigger, something that's about to be exposed. At the local motel, riders from 3 states gathered in smoke-filled rooms, planning what they saw as a necessary demonstration of force. None of them noticed the small devices James had already planted around the property, monitoring their every conversation, building a web of evidence that would eventually reach federal authorities. Rachel Martinez, treating Sarah for routine prenatal care at the local clinic, noticed the change in the pregnant woman's demeanor. Your brother's return has given you confidence, she observed, noting Sarah's improved vital signs. He's different from what I remember. Sarah admitted, the way he moves, the way he thinks, it's like he's always 10 steps ahead, seeing things the rest of us don't. Special forces changes people. Martinez replied quietly. Her own brother had served, though not at James's level. They learned to see the world differently. Threats, opportunities, strategic advantages. It becomes instinct. As night fell over Cedar Grove, James began implementing plans he developed since learning of the writer's harassment of his sister. Hidden cameras were positioned at key locations, monitoring equipment established, escape routes prepared. To anyone watching, it would have appeared random, but each preparation served a specific purpose. In what was to come at the diner, Sarah found a package from her brother, a new security system, sophisticated beyond anything a small town business would normally need. Standard surveillance countermeasures, James explained as he installed it. They'll try to watch us better if we control what they see. Iron Mike received another call, this one from higher up the writer's chain of command. Whatever's coming, his superior warned, contain it. We've got too much invested in that territory to let one man disrupt operations. But in his gut, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced since his time in Desert Storm, the recognition that he was facing someone operating at a level beyond his understanding. The way Miller had dismantled their intimidation attempt, the precision of his intelligence, the absolute confidence in his manner. This wasn't just a protective brother, this was someone who had spent years taking apart organizations far more sophisticated than their motorcycle club. James spent the night methodically preparing the diner and surrounding area, his movements guided by experience gained in countless operations worldwide. Each security measure, each tactical preparation served multiple purposes: defense, intelligence gathering, and evidence collection for what would come later. Remember what I taught you about strategic thinking, he asked Sarah as they finished the preparations. The best defense isn't just about stopping an attack, it's about making your opponent strength work against them. Sarah, watching her brother work, finally understood why he'd been chosen for missions that the government still wouldn't acknowledge. No, every action was calculated, every preparation serving multiple purposes. This wasn't just about protecting his sister, this was about exposing something bigger, something that had grown too confident in its own power. As Cedar Grove settled into an uneasy night, both sides prepared for what was to come. The riders gathered their forces, planning what they saw as a necessary reassertion of their authority, but James Miller, drawing on years of dismantling organizations that thought themselves untouchable, had already set in motion plans that would expose not just a motorcycle club's criminal activities, but a network of corruption that reached far beyond Georgia's state lines. The Crimson Riders made their first significant move against Miller's diner just after midnight. 20 bikes approached from different directions, their headlights off, engines barely above idle. Behind them came 3 black SUVs carrying what Iron Mike considered their most experienced enforcers. They thought they were being clever. James watched them through his night vision scope, documenting their approach with the detached precision of a man who'd done this countless times before. 23 bikes, 3 vehicles, he murmured into a digital recorder, maintaining his habit of documenting operations amateur, spacing predictable approach vectors. They're following the obvious paths, exactly as anticipated in town. Sheriff Cooper sat in his darkened patrol car, positioned strategically, not close enough to interfere, but near enough to respond if things went too far. His radio crackled with updates from Deputy Wilson, watching from another vantage point. Multiple vehicles approaching Miller's diner. Wilson whispered, "Should we intervene?" Not yet," Cooper replied, remembering his conversation with James Miller earlier that day. Sometimes the former Green Beret had told him the best way to end a fight is to let your opponent make their biggest mistake all at once. The first sign that something was wrong came when the lead bikes hit James' defensive preparations. Hidden cables at strategic heights took down 3 riders, their bikes crashing silently, engines modified to minimize noise before the others could react. The ground seemed to come alive beneath them. Carefully concealed pits, their edges reinforced with military-grade materials, swallowed 2 more bikes. What the hell? Iron Mike's voice carried in the darkness. He'd been coordinating from one of the SUVs, watching his careful plan dissolve into chaos. The remaining riders found themselves caught in private killing zones, though James's fire was deliberately non-lethal. Beanbag rounds and rubber bullets fired with sniper precision found gaps in their protective gear, hitting pressure points and nerve clusters with surgical accuracy. Martins, having stayed late at her clinic after receiving a warning from James, heard the first calls for medical assistance. As she prepared for incoming injuries, she studied the pattern emerging. Each wound was precisely placed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. This wasn't random defense, it was a demonstration. Spread out, Iron Mike ordered over their radio channel. "He's just one man, he can't cover all angles." A quiet voice responded on their frequency. "Actually, I can." The riders' communications erupted in confusion. James had hacked their channel, a skill learned from years of signals intelligence work. 6 men at the north approach, he narrated calmly. 4 more, about to discover the quicksand pits to the east. The rest of you might want to reconsider your choices. Sarah safely relocated to a secure location. James had prepared. Listen to the chaos unfolding over the police scanner. They weren't supposed to have. Martinez sat with her, monitoring her blood pressure. "Thomas used to talk about men like him," Sarah said quietly. "Said the truly dangerous ones don't just react, they make you do exactly what they want, exactly when they want it." The riders' operation had completely unraveled. Nearly half their force was down, taken out by non-lethal but extremely effective measures. The rest found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to pre-sighted positions. "Listen carefully." James's voice came through their radios again. "You're injured, need medical attention. They'll receive it once you withdraw. I've demonstrated what I can do with non-lethal methods. Don't make me show you the alternatives." Iron Mike, watching his carefully planned assault turn into a complete disaster, finally gave the order to retreat. As his men limped back to town, he turned to his lieutenant with a face carved from stone. "Call them," he ordered. "Call all of them. I want every heavy hitter. We have that old soldier just bought himself a war at the clinic." Martinez treated a steady stream of injuries, bruises, sprains, impact trauma, all expertly placed to incapacitate without crippling. One of the younger riders, still dazed, kept muttering about shadows coming alive and the ground itself turning. Against them, Sheriff Cooper finally drove up to the diner as dawn approached. He found James Lee erasing signs of the night's activities, restoring his defenses for the next encounter. That was quite a statement, Cooper observed. James checked another trap, resetting it with practiced ease. Had to show them what they're dealing with. Sometimes the best way to prevent escalation is to demonstrate the consequences. They'll come back harder, Cooper warned. Yes, James agreed, but now they'll be scared. Fear makes men predictable. Predictable men make mistakes. As the sun rose over Cedar Grove, word of the night's event spread rapidly. The riders' reputation for invincibility had been shattered by one man who turned their own aggression against them. But in his office, Ion Mike was already making calls to darker corners of their organization. I don't care what it costs, he growled into his phone. I want our best people, the ones we call when we need problems permanently solved. James spent the morning maintaining his defenses, his movements methodical and unhurried. To anyone watching, he might have appeared calm, even unconcerned, but Dever Martinez, bringing him supplies under the pretense of checking for injuries, noticed how his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. You knew exactly where to hit them, she said, exactly how to disable without killing. Sometimes the most effective violence is the ends you don't have to use, James replied, accepting the supplies. But they're about to change the rules, might not have that luxury next time. Cedar Grove held its breath, waiting for the riders' response. The quiet town was about to become a battlefield, and only one man seemed truly prepared for what that meant. Cedar Grove had never seen men like the ones who arrived 3 days after James's night of defense. They came in unmarked vehicles, 5 men with cold eyes and precise movements. They carried themselves differently from the regular riders, moving with the practice deficiency that only comes from years of professional violence. Former military contractors, James noted, watching through his scope as they assembled at the Riders Clubhouse. Private sector, now expensive talent in town. Dever Martinez was treating one of the younger riders for a sprained wrist when she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. The contractors weren't just here for James, they were preparing to clear the entire town for something bigger. Got the call from overseas, one contractor said quietly. Shipments start next month. Town needs to be secured by then. At the sheriff's office, Cooper was fighting his own battle. The county commissioner had called, pushing him to find some reason to arrest James. These bikers bring business to the county, the commissioner argued. One stubborn veteran isn't worth the trouble. With all due respect, Sir, Cooper replied, I don't think you understand what kind of man we're dealing with. James's morning was interrupted by Sarah's urgent arrival at the diner, her face ashen, hands shaking as she gripped her steering wheel. They came to my house, she said without preamble. Those new men said they know about my baby's father in Atlanta, said accidents happen to expectant mothers all the time. James' expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Stay here, he said quietly. Your room's already prepared. He'd known this was coming, had prepared guest rooms with defensive positions and escape routes. Sarah would be safer here than anywhere else in town. One of the contractors was demonstrating why Ion Mike had paid so much for their services. He walked into Miller's diner during the lunch rush, moving with lethal grace. Just coffee, he told the temporary waitress covering Sarah's shift, then raised his voice slightly. And information about James Miller. $110,000 for anything useful. The diner fell silent. Then old Joe Barnes, who'd lived in Cedar Grove for 60 years, stood up. Got some information for you, he said clearly. The diner you're so interested in ground's been soaked in blood before. My granddaddy used to say some land chooses its owners. Might want to think about that. The contractor moved with stunning speed, but he never reached Joe. James, who'd entered silently moments before, stepped between them. His movement was so smooth, so perfectly economical, that most patrons didn't even realize what happened. One moment, the contractor was advancing, the next he was frozen in place, James's hand positioned to end things permanently. Poor choice, James said softly. The contractor felt cold metal pressed precisely against his kidney. He hadn't even seen James draw the combat knife. You're dead, the contractor growled. Just don't know it yet. We're not like the regular crew. We're professionals. No, James's voice remained conversational. Your men playing at war. I am war. He released the contractor with a slight push. The man stumbled, his trained grace suddenly absent for the first time. He felt what the younger riders had been trying to describe, the sensation of being in the presence of something far deadlier than himself. Martinez, witnessing the scene, finally understood what she'd seen in James's classified records, the way he moved, the precision of his control. This wasn't just military training, this was something else entirely. At the clubhouse, the contractors regrouped with Iron Mike and his lieutenants. Your old man's got serious training, their leader admitted. Might be Tier 1 background, maybe Delta. Iron Mike slammed his fist on the table. I don't care if he's Godam Captain America. I want him gone. Careful what you wish for, the contractor replied quietly. Men like him, there's a reason. Their records are sealed, a reason people speak of them in whispers. James spent the afternoon making preparations of a different kind. He visited key points in town, speaking quietly with selected residents. Each conversation was brief. But when he left, those people began making their own preparations. Sheriff Cooper, watching this, finally understood. You're not just defending your sister's diner, he said when James stopped by his office. You're preparing the whole town. They showed their hand with Sarah. James replied, this isn't about one property anymore. They want the town. That means everyone's involved, whether they want to be or not. As evening approached, Martinez drove up to James' position. With medical supplies, she found him teaching Sarah how to use the defensive features he built into the diner. I accessed some restricted medical files, she told him quietly. Operation Coastwalker, that was you, wasn't it? The operative who specialized in turning territory against aggressors. James' silence was answer enough. Those men they brought in, she continued, they're planning something big. I heard them talking about international shipments, major distribution networks. I know, James replied, checking his surveillance feeds. Been tracking their supply line since I got back. That's why I came here. This town is their weakness, their only viable route for whatever they're planning. KM fell over Cedar Grove, but few people slept. The contractors and riders had spent the day studying the town, marking positions, making plans, but they didn't realize they were being watched too. James's preparations hadn't just been physical. He turned the entire community into a network of observers in the darkness. James checked his defenses one final time. Tomorrow would bring violence, real violence, not just demonstrations. The riders had brought in professionals, but they still didn't understand what they were facing. They thought they were hunting a retired soldier. Instead, they were about to learn why some men's military records remain sealed, why some operations are never acknowledged, and why the truly dangerous ones are the ones who wait patiently for their enemies to walk into their trap. The contractors made their move at dawn, using techniques that had worked in a dozen other conflicts. They approached Miller's Diner in tactical formation, their movement speaking of years of professional experience. Their leader, a man known only as Hawk, had orchestrated similar operations worldwide. But as they crossed the perimeter of the diner property, Hawk felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The street was too quiet. No early morning activity, just silence in the growing light of dawn. Something's wrong, Hawk muttered into his radio. He's waiting for us from his concealed position. James watched through his scope. Their formation was perfect, their approach professional, but they'd made one critical mistake, that they were fighting on ground he had prepared meticulously over the past weeks. The first sign that this wasn't a normal operation came when Hawk's communications went dead, not jammed, just silent. In the growing light, he saw why dozens of small devices scattered across the property, military-grade signal killers that shouldn't have been available to civilians. He's got better equipment than we do, Hawk's second-in-command whispered. This wasn't retired military gear. James's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, transmitted through speakers hidden throughout the property. Last chance to walk away. Next demonstration won't be non-lethal. Inside the clinic, Martinez was preparing her medical supplies when Sheriff Cooper rushed in. Got a call from a contact in the FBI, he said breathlessly. Finally got a hit on some of James's records. He wasn't just special forces, he was part of something called the Shadow Protocol. The what? Classified unit specialized in dismantling criminal organizations by turning their own territory against them. Everything else is redacted at the diner. The contractors discovered why James's reputation had spread through combat zones. Like whispered legend, their carefully planned approach fell apart as the very ground seemed to fight against them. Hidden deterrents appeared where solid earth should be. Tactical countermeasures triggered by their own movement. Every attempt to gain tactical advantage led them into prided defensive zones. Hawk watched his team's formation crumble. Fall back, he ordered. Full retreat. Too late, James's voice came again. You crossed the line when you threatened my pregnancy sister. The first contractor went down so fast the others barely saw it happen. A shadow moved through the morning mist, and suddenly their close quarters combat specialist was unconscious, taken out with a precision that spoke of decades of experience. Jesus Christ, Hawk breathed. He's not just good, he's the second contractor never finished his sentence. James moved like smoke. His techniques are deadly mix of military training and hard-earned combat experience. Each strike was precisely calculated, targeting nerve clusters and weak points with surgical accuracy. At the Riders' Clubhouse, Iron Mike and his lieutenants watched through binoculars as their expensive professionals were systematically dismantled. What the hell did you get us into? One lieutenant demanded. That's not some retired soldier. That's something else entirely. From behind them came Sarah's voice, cold and clear. You should have done better research. The Shadow Protocol. It wasn't about killing, it was about breaking organizations from the inside out. They spun to find her standing there, protected by several of Cedar Grove's citizens, all armed and ready. The Riders had been so focused on James, they'd missed his real strategy. He'd been preparing the whole town. Back at the diner, Hawk found himself the last contractor standing. His team lay scattered across the property, each taken down with precision that bordered on artistry. Through the clearing mist, he saw James approaching, moving with the calm certainty of a man who'd never doubted the outcome. Shadow Protocol, Hawk said quietly, should have recognized the signs. The way you prepared the ground, the psychological warfare. You're the one they talked about in Damascus, the shadow that broke the entire Eastern Syndicate network. You threatened a pregnant woman. James replied softly, made it personal. We've got resources. Hawk tried international connections. This isn't over. Yes, James's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. It is. The fight that followed was brief but instructive. Hawk was good, very good, but James moved like something from another world. Each technique honed by decades of operations in places the government denied existing. When it ended, Hawk lay unconscious, defeated by a man who'd forgotten more about combat than most would ever learn. Dr. Martinez arrived to treat the injured contractors, noting how each had been disabled with precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of human anatomy. You could have killed them, she said quietly. Death teaches no lessons, James replied, helping her with her medical bag. But they'll remember this. Sometimes memory is a better deterrent than a grave. In town, the Riders found themselves facing an awakened community. Armed citizens watched their every move. Cameras recorded their activities, and their usual intimidation tactics fell flat against people who'd found their courage. Iron Mike sat in his office reviewing what they knew about James's background. The Shadow Protocol files were heavily redacted, but one phrase kept appearing: specializes in converting hostile territory into unsurvivable ground for targeted organizations. We didn't just pick a fight with the retired soldier, his lieutenant realized. We picked a fight with the man they sent to destroy cartels. As evening approached, James helped Dr. Martinez load the injured contractors into ambulances. Hawk, barely conscious, grabbed his arm. The shipments, he mumbled. You don't understand what's coming. The people we work for, they don't accept failure. I know exactly what's coming, James replied. Been tracking your organization since before I came back. You're not here for ordinary criminal activity. This is about weapons. Shy isn't it international arms trade? Hawk's eyes widened slightly, confirming James' suspicion. The quiet veteran helped load the last contractor, then turned to Sheriff Cooper. Things are about to get complicated, he said softly. Their real operators will come now, the ones they don't talk about, the ones who solve problems permanently. The sun set over Cedar Grove, painting the sky in shades of blood red. The town had changed. People Who walked taller looked their neighbors in the eye, but everyone could feel it. This was just the beginning, the real storm was still coming. Cedar Grove woke to the sound of helicopters. 3 black civilian models touched down at the small municipal airport, disgorging men in expensive suits who moved with military precision. These weren't bikers or contractors. These were the real power behind the riders' operation. James watched through his scope as a convoy of luxury SUVs left the airport right on schedule. He murmured, noting how they moved in defensive formation, finally showing their true faces in her clinic. Dar Martinez was examining blood work from the injured contractors when she noticed something disturbing. Trace elements in their systems matched classified reports she'd seen during her military service. Compounds used by international arms dealers to track their operatives. They're not just running guns, she told Sheriff Cooper during an urgent meeting. These are the same markers I saw in Somalia. They're moving serious military hardware. Cooper was fighting his own battle. The county commissioner had called another emergency meeting, pushing to have him replaced. Face it, Tom, the commissioner said, his voice carrying the weight of corporate influence. You're backing the wrong side. These businessmen bring opportunities to the county. Businessman, Cooper laughed coldly. Is that what we're calling arms dealers now? At the diner James was hosting an unusual gathering, Sarah watched from the kitchen as a group of hard-faced men arrived in unmarked vehicles. They'd moved like her brother did, quiet professionals who'd seen too much and learned too well. Called in some old friends, James explained, people who understand and what we're dealing with. One of them, a weathered man named Carter, studied James' defensive preparations with professional appreciation. Just like Baghdad, he commented, remember how you turned that whole district into a trap? This is different, James replied softly. This time, we're protecting homes, not just completing missions in town. The new arrivals made their presence known. Alexander Kane, the corporate operations true commander, took over the largest suite at the local hotel. His men began a sophisticated surveillance operation using technology that shouldn't have been available to civilians. Miller's not just some retired operator, Kane told his team during their first briefing. Intelligence suggests he was part of the Shadow Protocol,